Hello, my name is Ayana Grant. My interest in this topic comes from my own personal identities as well as interpersonal and experiences that I have had within academic spaces of people not acknowledging their relationship to certain issues or the way that what they are saying or thinking recenters their own identity, just sort of like a lack of accountability and self-awareness within participating in these conversations about allyship, minorities, decolonialism, all of these different things. And so this presentation will be divided into a number of sections, primarily through this list of questions, which are: what combinations of factors prevent people from being effective allies? What outside factors require or encourage people to continue to be comfortable in their privilege? What stops educated people from acknowledging their participation in hegemony? And finally, what are ways to be an effective ally? A number of key terms will be covered as I move through these sections with relation to the readings that I have taken them from. These key terms are racial capitalism, anti-relationality, epistemology, epistemic privilege, standpoint epistemology, decolonization, settler colonialism, and settler moves to innocence. Our first question is: what combinations of factors prevent people from being effective allies? In order to this question, we have to explore the relationship between people and the economic systems that we live under. And so I will be analyzing the relationship between race, identity, and capitalism, which is a system that most people in Western countries live under. Western countries includes places like the United States, Canada, a lot of Western Europe, and Australia, places that are thought of as the global north or previously termed first world countries. Capitalism is where the country's trade, political, economic systems, and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. An easy example would be a corporation like Walmart or Amazon, where there is a person at the top who greatly profits, and then they have workers who receive significantly less of the finances produced from the capital output. So corporations like Amazon and Walmart and other large corporations are able to then use the output from the capital that they create to influence things like judiciary and legal systems through lobbying. They can donate money to political campaigns and ensure that political candidates will create policy based on their interests. And so that is sort of a general overview of capitalism. And to sort of zoom back out, capitalism sort of cannot exist without these issues of colonialism, neocolonialism, because to begin with, in order for these corporations to exist, Europeans came over to the Americas, had wars with the native peoples, committed genocide against them, killing millions of indigenous people, forcing them to do labor, and then when so many indigenous people had been killed, then bringing over Black Africans to continue to do that labor. And so those people of color who are laborers, and then the people at the top who are white people who are creating these systems of labor, replicate this system of colonialism pretty clearly with relationship to the current time that we live in. And so even though a lot of people push the narrative that things are different now, those things are pretty directly integrated into current systems. We can see this through things like the prison industrial complex, or this case of Johnson versus McIntosh, which is a case presided over by Justice John Marshall in the early 1800s using religious racism and the doctrine of discovery, which basically says that any land that is not owned by white Christian people is free to be colonized, and that is directly integrated and referenced on an extremely regular basis when having to think about issues when justices are presiding over cases with relationship to land, indigenous lands, all these types of things. And so Jody Melamed, who I'm referencing here, says that all capitalism is racial capitalism because capitalism was created under an unbalanced system with somebody at the top and somebody at the bottom, with the people at the bottom being people of color. And so this labor was directly formed out of the labor. This labor system was directly formed out of the labor of racialized peoples. And so Melamed says, capital can only be capital when it is accumulating, and it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Capitalists with the means of production, workers without the means of subsistence, creditors, debtors, conquerors of land made property, the dispossessed and removed. And so through these dichotomies, we can see it replicated with various marginalized groups, people of color, queer people, disabled people, as well as poor white people, all of these distinct groups created by these social systems known as multiculturalism, these distinct groups created by different identities that exist necessarily because of capitalism, because these groups are valued based on their ability to contribute to this capitalist system, meaning that some groups will be valued over others based on their ability to contribute to this capitalist system. And so there will be this infighting based on these identities. For example, disabled people cannot legally receive assistance from the American government if they make over $2,000 a month, meaning that people will automatically say that disabled people are less valuable because they contribute less to society, aka capitalism, which means that non-disabled people will then be put above disabled people in how they are valued. This also could translate to the idea of model minorities, with certain groups being valued over others because of their false ability to be able to serve capitalism. Some other groups I've listed are lesbian and gay people who exclude trans people, and then, as we are seeing, later receive backlash from these ideological parties that they are aligning themselves with, or black men leaving behind black women and other people in their communities. And we see this currently in Florida in both of these groups, with Florida legislature in trying to integrate into school systems, saying that black people actually benefited from slavery, and black Republicans are saying, no, now you've gone too far. But because they've benefited by separating themselves from their community, they are sort of participating directly in this infighting that in a system that never benefited them in the first place. What I'm describing here is called anti-relationality, this infighting between various groups which have been created by capitalism, even if they are packed tightly close together, as a lot of poor groups tend to be. They are, even if they're physically close together, they are emotionally distant from each other, as well as distant from nature, because a lot of urban societies are separated from natural land and resources and things like that. And so now that we have the background for what circumstances people are trying to be allies within and having issues under, we can ask the question, what outside factors require or encourage people to continue to be comfortable in their privilege? And so the main issue that I've outlined is an issue of epistemics or epistemology, which is the study of how we know what we know and, what we learn. And so an issue of epistemology might be whether or not I am taught about slavery or colonialism in public school, or what narratives I'm taught about the Civil War or things like that. So those are epistemological issues, issues that are related to what you have learned. And what you learn and what your identity is as you learn it, particularly with relation to racial identities, influence your relationship to what you learn and the privileges you have with acknowledging that information. So what I've just described is standpoint epistemology, your social location, and how it influences what you know. And I say social location and not just identity, because regardless of whether I identify as Black or African American or a descendant of African Americans or what have you, people will see my social location visibly as a person of color and treat me accordingly. And so, as a person of color, I am then predisposed to understand issues about people of color when I am taught certain things, such as the history of the Civil War, for example. Breonna Toole, who I'm referencing here, she gives the example of colorism. She experienced colorism in high school, and then later on in her life learned the word colorism, and that allowed her to be able to more easily identify colorism when, for example, lighter-skinned women are employed in modeling or shown represented in media or things like that. So that is called epistemic privilege, and even though this is listed or identified as a privilege, it occurs because of your lack of privilege in social standing. You're predisposed to understand this thing because it is not widely talked about, but instead because you have experienced it. So this is a quote from Toole talking about the nuance of terms like colorism and their people who have social privileges being reticent to recognize them because it is more nuanced than terms like racism and far less general. She says, to illustrate, dominantly situated knowers who lack the concept of colorism may fail to realize that this is what I experienced in the example. In fact, they may fail to see that anything untoward happened at all, or it may strike them as an ordinary occurrence that warrants no further investigation. And so here we sort of see the split between lack of knowledge preventing someone from being an effective ally versus someone's sort of willful ignorance about an issue preventing their effective allyship, because Toole may explain to someone that she has experienced colorism, but they, as she says, may be reticent to acknowledge what happened because they cannot experience colorism socially. And so when people become educated about these issues, they may feel implicated, they may feel guilty, and thus sort of be more likely to do what Toole is talking about, where people are willfully ignoring these issues that people bring up. And so earlier I talked about colonialism and decolonization, and I'm bringing these back partially because they're terms that are necessary to talk about some of the other terms that I'm going to talk about, but also because it is important to be specific when talking about the sort of various things that inform us and influence us to be reluctant to talk about these issues. So decolonization brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. It is not a metaphor for other things we want to do or improve our societies or schools. Tuck and Yang, this is a quote from Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Wayne K. Yang, and they're bringing this up because they talk about the metaphorization of the word decolonization and it being substituted for education, people talking about decolonizing their schools and decolonizing their minds, when that's not what decolonization is. Decolonization is literal and visible and disruptive to systems of power. And so these people who are talking about and using decolonization as a metaphor are often settlers who then participate in settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is the extraction of indigenous resources such as plants and animals to transport them and build wealth for colonizers, which harkens back to my example of colonizers coming in for resources such as gold, tobacco, cotton, things like that, to export them across the world to be able to give themselves money while exploiting other people. And then settler colonialism also involves biological, geological, and political management of people, land, plants, and animals within the borders of the created imperial nation, with the imperial nation being specified because these borders were created not by indigenous people and are not inherently natural, but instead are created by governments and individuals with these settler interests. And so it also involves controlling prisons, ghettos, creating minorities, schooling, and policing, which are all benefiting this elite that I talked about with relation to racial capitalism as well, and being more specific with things like schooling. Lots of indigenous people of recent generations were sent to correctional schools where they were forced not to speak their languages and had violence committed against them. Among many other things, many children were killed because of their indigeneity, all of this happening at schools. Or, for example, policing, with its inception being to return enslaved people to their masters. And so these are other institutions, racist institutions, that remain in our society and transform and so they still have racist remnants even if they are not acting the same as they were before. And so while bringing this up, it's important to note that all non-indigenous people in places that have been colonized are settlers. And when recognizing this and going back to things like settler colonialism, people feel guilty, and it becomes an issue of guilt and ego, because regardless of whether or not you are a state entity, the management of people, land, plants, and animals via these state entities, we all are complicit in using and experiencing and sometimes enforcing. And so this issue of ego and guilt often stops people from acknowledging their participation in hegemony. And so when people feel this ego and this guilt, they perform settler moves to innocence. Within the context of indigeneity, Tuck and Yang list three main points, which are people, non-indigenous people, creating a long-lost native ancestor with quote-unquote Indian blood. They talk about politicians doing this, often with generations ago, people claiming to remember this ancestor, removing their accountability, both currently and historically, with relationship to colonialism, saying we couldn't have harmed indigenous people because we are indigenous people. Another one is creating stories and narratives where a white person is adopted into indigeneity, where they create a narrative where an indigenous group adopts a white person, and because they're not like the other white people, and then the indigenous group tends to die off or become diminished, and they hand over their land and hand over their claim to the land to this white person. And these types of narratives allow these people instead to say, no, we did not commit genocide, we did not commit violence against these people, they gave these lands to us. And then the final thing that Tuck and Yang outline is calling different groups colonized when they are not. And because regardless of your racial status, all of us are influenced by colonization, this knowledge and misplaced sort of ideology allows people to say none of us are settlers because we're all influenced by colonization, which is not true. If you are not indigenous, then you are a settler. And so other moves to innocence that are not necessarily related to indigeneity, but can give some clarity to what I'm talking about, are using proximities to minorities. The classic "I can't be racist. I have a black boyfriend or a black friend or whatever. I'm not this. That was just a joke." Inaccurate use of language in order to redefine issues, as well as recentering whiteness, with people saying, well, my family came over after colonialism, and so we're not directly harming people, or we didn't participate in colonialism, failing to recognize that their moving to America makes them a settler as well. And so, what are some effective ways to be an ally now that we are sort of acknowledging all of these factors? What prevents people, what makes space for people to resist being effective allies? Some ways to be an effective ally involve reflection, education, and action. Acknowledgement and self-reflection goes beyond saying, I've said this thing that's racist or homophobic in the past. It requires you to be specific with your actions, and not just saying this was wrong, but being specific about how it was wrong, being specific about how it was influenced by colonial ideologies, or was related to ableism or internalized misogyny or homophobia or whatever. It's paramount to doing that is, of course, educating yourself through all of these things I will list. It is most important to educate yourself because you cannot continue to do the work of being an ally without continually educating yourself. And so that education allows you to then continue to do self-reflection of recognizing your own relationships to privilege, colonialism, and capitalism. For instance, I might be black, but I'm not a dark-skinned black person. I'm not indigenous. I'm not, related to any indigenous groups, and so that gives me a privilege that other black people may not have, despite the fact that I'm gay, or other minority statuses that I might have. And so an example of education, self-reflection, action is this group called PSAR, which stands for People in Search of Safe and Accessible Restrooms. They're a group of disabled and queer people in UC Santa Barbara that focuses on making bathrooms more accessible for disabled people, transgender people, gender non-conforming people, parents with babies, because many bathrooms on college campuses don't have changing rooms, or changing tables, rather. And so if you are cisgender and able-bodied, or you don't have kids, or are not any of these things, then you may never had to have considered the fact that these are issues that people face. And so in doing these sort of actions, it's not just saying this bathroom isn't accessible, but they are making visible this issue of inaccessibility by going into these bathrooms with bright yellow shirts, measuring things, informing people by going to board meetings and city council meetings and things like that, and creating maps of safe and accessible bathrooms to make these places that are safe for these people listed more known, because sometimes it is an issue of people just not knowing where safety is. And so they are direct about their bathroom politics through their name. It's unavoidable that Pissar is associated with using the bathroom. They're doing work to reframe what bodies are important to talk about, because in traditional settings, the people who are focused on are people who traditionally pass as men and women, who are physically able-bodied, and so those people with those bodies are forefronted, but through the work of Pissar, they are saying these people are important too, and so we are cataloging the disability accessible bathrooms, the gender nonconforming or family bathrooms, bathrooms that have changing tables, all these things, and asking questions like, why shouldn't all bathrooms have pad and tampon dispensers and changing tables? And even those types of thinking allow people to be able to begin to make changes. They emphasize the fact that refusing to talk about these issues leaves behind the people that are most affected by them. If you're familiar with queer history and queer politics, you may have heard the phrase or the slogan, silence equals death, with relation to the AIDS epidemic. And although this instance is not necessarily an epidemic, it emphasizes the fact that if we do not talk about these issues, then harm comes to the people who they affect the most. And so a quote from Pissar is, the Pissar patrols turn non-disabled people's attention toward the social barriers confronting people with disabilities. Rather than focusing on the alleged failures and hardships of disabled bodies, an inability to see, an inability to walk, Pissar focuses on the failures and omissions of the built environment: a too narrow door, a too high dispenser, sinks that are too high or too low, other sort of issues that people are not thinking about with relation to bathrooms when it comes to people with different types of bodies. And so now that we are then talking about bathrooms, we're normalizing the fact that people go to bathrooms to pee and poop. Then we can then talk about the importance of having bathrooms in public, and the fact that a lot of there are not a lot of public bathrooms because of anti-homelessness. And then once we can acknowledge that, then we can focus on anti-homeless issues. So that's just an example, but all of this work that Pissar does to be able to have accessible bathrooms in more than one type of way means that then we can do more work to help not only the people that they are outlining, but also people who they may not have even realized are affected by these issues. And so these things that I've outlined, making their politics visible, talking about these, going to city council meetings or board meetings, or making other people aware of the fact that there's this issue, are all concrete and accountable ways that you can become a better ally, because in order to do these things, you have to first educate yourself. And once you are educating yourself, then you can begin the process of talking about these issues. You can do all these things that I've listed, and then begin to educate other people about these issues, which allows us to further the message of effective allyship. And so my discussion questions for sort of, thoughts to leave you with as you hopefully search for ways to become a better ally are, how do you see yourself actionably avoiding the behaviors that I've outlined, which we are all guilty of, even me, We all perform moves to innocence. We all may have said things that no longer align with our beliefs, but it's important to acknowledge those things and then continue to educate ourselves. We can also ask, what are ways that your identities and or privileges inform your daily life as an intersectional subject? Regardless of your identities, you experience the effects of multiple at once. You might be lower class and white and trans and straight, or middle class and black and a queer man, for example. And so all of these combinations of possible identities means that we are differently affected by systems in place, or have the privilege of not being affected by certain issues, as given with the example of Pissar. My final question is, how can I become and be informed in a way that allows others to be able to communicate with me about my unhelpful behaviors language, which returns back to this first point of us all naturally being performing these unhelpful or negative actions. Like I said, we all make mistakes. We all say things that we then become educated about and learn that those things are negative. So keeping in mind being open to feedback is also one way that you can continue to educate yourself. Finally, I just have a list of my sources, which is Calling All Restroom Revolutionaries, which is the Pissar article, Racial Capitalism by Jody Melamed, From Standpoint Epistemology to Epistemic Oppression by Brianna Toole, and Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. If you've never heard of any of these articles, I would highly recommend reading them. All of these articles were foundational for me understanding and educating myself about all of these issues, so I would highly recommend them. I appreciate you taking the time to review my presentation, and I hope any of this information was helpful and educational.